I guess we'll go ahead and get started. I'm delighted to welcome Charlie PIOT. He is the professor of cultural anthropology and African American studies at Duke University. Charlie's work focuses on political economy and the history of rural West Africa, and he's done most of his work in Togo. I think many of you know his first book, Remotely Global, which is Remotely Global Village Modernity in West Africa. And that book, published in 1999, took rural Togo, a place that had been theorized by earlier anthropology as out of the way, and re-theorized it within a system of global modernity. And that book got the Emery Talbot Prize and also was a finalist for the Herskovits Prize, which is the prize for the best book in African studies. His new book, or most recent book, published in 2010 by the University of Chicago Press, is called Nostalgia for the Future. West Africa After the Cold War. And that book explores the ways in which human rights discourse, democratization, NGOs, and charismatic Christianity are remaking sovereignty, the biopolitical and political culture in Togo. And that book was the winner of the African Politics Conference Group Award. And in that book, one of the chapters talks about the green card lottery and how Togolese are trying to find a way, and here I'm quoting from somebody in the book that Charlie quotes, build hope that there is life beyond Togo and that they can live like everyone else, as he cites one person saying. So the chapter in Nostalgia for the Future that focuses on the green card lottery is now the basis of another book in progress that is looking at West African expatriates in the US and Europe, and that's what he will be talking to us about today. I should say that he's also edited another book along with Brian Goldstone and Juan Obarrio that examines the making of futures and precarity across the African continent. And he is the editor, along with Anne Allison, of Cultural Anthropology. And I think he's been responsible, together with Anne Allison, for making that journal, I think, one of the most exciting and vibrant in contemporary anthropology today. So today we're lucky to hear him speak about the US lottery and global citizenship. And I should say that this event is funded by the Center for International Studies and the Provost Steele Fund for African Studies. And that it's also, as many of you here know, part of a much larger event at Wilder House that'll be taking place tomorrow that looks at permanence, flux, and mobility in contemporary Africa. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Charlie PIOT.
Jennifer, thank you for that. So I'm going to present a chapter from the new book on the visa lottery. I think probably most of you know what this system is, but for those who don't, let me give a sort of brief overview. The U.S. State Department, since the early 90s, has given out 50,000 green cards a year to people in countries around the world, countries that are underrepresented in the U.S. And it does so through a lottery. People sign up in the fall. The system is all online today, and they hear in early May. The new results have just come out. If you're selected, you have to go for an interview at the U.S. Embassy in the country that you're residing in. And you have to show that you're qualified. There are two main criteria. One is that you have to have a high school diploma, or you have to have a job that's on the U.S. Labor Department job list of needed jobs in the States. To go for the interview, you have to pay not just what tourists pay to get a tourist visa, $150, but last year it was $819 just to show up for the interview. If you take a wife and children, it's 819 times. You also have to pay $200 for a medical exam. You have to pay to have documents translated. And this is a big problem for many Africans, how to come up with the money to pay for that. In Togo, the country I work in, there are more per capita Togolese who apply for the I'll call it the DV lottery, diversity visa lottery, That's what they call it in the State Department. More per capita Togolese who apply for it than those from any other African country. It's literally the biggest game in town during the sign-up period in October. Cyber cafes put up signs, come get your visa here. There are entrepreneurs all over the city who help people sign up and who later on, if they're selected, help them, coach them for the interview at the embassy. The interview at the embassy is a tricky a moment, and I'm going to talk about a lot of that today. I have worked for many years with a very close friend who is one of these entrepreneurs or a broker. The embassy calls him a fixer. In Ghana, they call him a connection man. He's a very clever guy, and I first met him through his father, who is from the village that I work in northern Togo. We became good friends, and at some point, he started telling me stories about his own application. Initially, he signed up many people, mostly women, because he wanted to be able to attach himself to a winner, and did that, went for the embassy interview, and the person who he'd signed up completely froze up at the interview and couldn't answer easy question after easy question, and they failed. He's tried twice more, failed both times. So his own story is a sad, even tragic story. What he does is, when he has winners, and he signs up about 2,000 people a year, he arranges financing for them if they can't come up with their own. Of course, most of them can't. Over $1,000, few Togolese, even salary Togolese, have that sort of money sitting around in their bank accounts or at their houses. And so what he does is he arranges for them to marry someone who has a family member, usually in the States, who can bankroll the embassy interview for both of them. It's someone who usually wants to bring his sister over, maybe his wife, a family member, and that person is willing to pay for the embassy interview fees, the medical exams, the plane tickets, and the service fee that my friend, I'll call him Kojo, that he takes, his cut. And if they're successful at the interview, immediately they get a green card as soon as they arrive in the States. So it's a done deal, and it's actually a very cheap way for someone to get their sister or a family member a green card. The embassy knows that, and the loophole in the system is that you can add a spouse after you've been selected. And I've talked to people at the State Department about this, and they say, well, we can't discriminate against people falling in love, and that could happen whenever. And it's actually 2 years between the time when you apply and you go for the interview, or up to 2 years. So they say, of course, it could happen any time. So that's the loophole. If they close that loophole, it would cut out a lot of the gamesmanship around the system, but they never have. And it would take something like an act of Congress to do it. Congress originally passed the part of the immigration law that created the visa lottery system. It is currently, in the new immigration bill, going to be cut out of the system altogether. So I hope that doesn't go through, but it looks like it may this year. They've been talking about it for many years, especially the Republicans don't like the idea of getting citizenship based on a lottery system. What if someone from Al-Qaeda won the lottery and came into the States that way, is what I've heard again and again, right? So there's a lot of gamesmanship around the financing of it and the arranging of these marriages. The U.S. Embassy, of course, knows that all of this is going on. And so they do what consuls, I think, all over the world do when they're in doubt about the relationship between spouses. During the interview, they typically separate spouses, and they ask a set of questions, same set of questions to both. When did you meet? When were you married? What are your husband's family members' names? Where do you live? What are the colors what's the color of your draperies in your bedroom? They also have a fraud unit that they've added in the last 5 years in Togo, and I think in many West African countries. Of Togolese they've hired, there are 2 in Togo, who circulate around the city to see if these folks are really married or not. My friend Kojo knows that this is going to happen, so he, of course, makes sure that they live together in an apartment a month before the interview or longer, and that they're prepared for that. And there's sort of a cat and mouse game back and forth. One of my favorite questions a couple of years ago was the medical examiner had written on the medical report that the man had a scar on his upper leg. The consul was doing the interview with the wife and saw this note in the file and asked the woman what leg his scar was on. She guessed the wrong leg, and they failed the interview. But no sooner had they failed than people on the street heard about this within hours, literally, and began also examining one another's bodies before they went for the interview. And so it's this cat and mouse game back and forth between street and embassy. The embassy knows that these marriages are being arranged. The street knows that they know. The embassy knows that they know, and so on. And it's a very interesting sort of back and forth. And a lot of the book that I'm writing has several chapters on that back and forth and the coaching that goes on before the interview, and so on. And I've been lucky that I've not only been able to talk to people on the street, but consuls at the consulate as well. And they have very interesting sort of takes on this whole system. I want to frame this in terms of sort of 4 large theoretical frames for the text, and I'm just going to allude to them very briefly. We can come back to these later during discussion if you want. One is it's a story about West African ingenuity, a sort of modern-day trickster story, if you will. Of course, this is an old theme within the anthropology of West Africa in particular, and yet I think it has a new twist today. Someone like Kojo, who is face-to-face with the consul, although he's never met the consul, but he sees himself very much trying to get over on the consul. So it's about a sort of trickster at the borders of the nation, trying to get his clients over to the States. Secondly, it's a story also about abjection, about social death, about the emptiness of citizenship in the current moment in Togo, and I think throughout much of West Africa today. If you go to Abidjan, 80% of youth will say they want to get to the States. The same thing in Ghana, even though Ghana's doing quite a bit better than most other West African countries today. It's certainly true in Nigeria and Benin as well. And it's very much about the abjection that folks feel back home, and they have a fantasy of another, and the U.S. has in many ways come to sort of constitute that other. So it's about that fantasy, it's about a desire for global inclusion, in a moment, in I think a very new biopolitical moment, in which the borders are very much being sealed. It's very hard to get a visa anymore to travel, even a tourist visa. The consul told me in December when I was talking with him that they're even looking at student visas now, and they can track students right through their stays in the U.S. They know if they're still in school or not. They know whether they got married or not. They know where they live, of course. In this giant database that they have. They're very intent on denying people who can't prove that they won't return home afterwards. So it's a moment that I see at least as one in which African peoples within their nation states are being incarcerated and enclaved within the continent as never before. Thirdly, there's a sort of large ethical issue that I faced from the beginning of this project. and that is whether I could even write this story, because I'm of course revealing secrets on the street about how people get their visas, and it's something we can talk about maybe more during the Q&A afterwards. I've of course asked Kojo this many times. He wants to be a co-author. I asked him if he would be a co-author on the book. He wants to be a co-author. And his answer about writing this stuff up is, he says, well, they know it all already, and they know a lot of it, and especially through these two Togolese folks that they've hired to circulate around. They, as another person said, reveal all our secrets. So they know a lot of it, but Kojo feels that he's always one step ahead of them. Whatever they throw in his face, he can figure out a way to get around it. So in any case, there's that sort of issue about revealing state secrets. And fourthly, it's a story about, and I think you'll see this in the paper that I'm going to present, about laughter. These stories are funny stories. I try to write them as funny stories. When they're told on the street, they engender laughter. And the question for me there is whether we can laugh and find pleasure in stories about immigration and stories about global abjection at the same time. So this is part of a chapter from the book. It's called Kinship by Other Means. And you'll have to stay with me. There's a lot of details in these stories, but you've got to get the details in order to understand the larger points. When I visited Kojo in his bureau, a hole-in-the-wall office in a seedy area of Lomé, on a steamy day in July 2010, he was vexed by the case of a young couple going for their second embassy interview. The wife had been pregnant when they went for the first interview to present their documents, pregnant by her real, not her fictive spouse, and a sympathetic consul told them she hoped the verification process went quickly so that they might arrive in the States before their baby was born, thus avoiding having to pay an additional, at that time, $775 for the baby's visa. But months went by before they were called for the second interview, with a woman giving birth in the interim. Kojo's worry now was that the embassy might demand a DNA test before giving a visa to the baby, thus threatening to uncover their ruse. Given the risks, the couple and their financier in the States, the husband's sister, thought it best to leave the baby at home for the second interview, hoping the consul wouldn't remember their earlier meeting. But Kojo worried that an alert consul with a good memory might wonder why they hadn't brought the infant to the interview, given the large upside of getting a visa for the infant right away. Waiting to apply would not only mean that mother and child would be separated for several years, but also certainly set the couple up for a DNA test, whose results would reveal that the child and its mother's visa spouse were unrelated, also potentially reopening the entire case. In the end, Kojo convinced the couple that the risk of taking the baby was less than leaving it behind. That, as he put it, once having, quote, opened the door of pregnancy, they couldn't turn back now. In prepping the couple for the interview, Kojo insisted on one thing, that they enter the interview room with the father holding the baby, and that they pass it back and forth during the interview. But he also instructed not too often. The strategy worked like a charm. The consul was friendly from the start and appeared positively taken with the infant, even leaving her perch behind the window to hold it in her arms. After a few minutes of light conversation and no hint of a DNA test, she granted visas to all three. Kojo drew an important lesson from this case and stumbled into a new strategy. While he was initially upset at the couple for getting pregnant without telling him, because of the complications and risks the pregnancy introduced, he now realized that a woman's bulging stomach or a baby in hand might have a powerful legitimating effect. There seems something incontrovertible and real about a mother with child, or about her husband showing it affection. Here the baby seemed to stand in for the spoken of the interview itself. Instead of earnest, believable responses to consul questions or proof of marriage photos constituting a couple's authenticity, the pregnancy alone appeared to do that work, with words no longer necessary. An additional dilemma presented itself during the run-up to the couple's second interview. Since the mother had already given birth, which father's name to put on the baby's birth certificate, the birth father's or the fictive father's? Kojo insisted that for the interview it had to be the latter, but he also suggested that the parents obtain a second birth certificate with the birth father's name so that it would be easy for the child to later reclaim his natal identity. Still, the fictive father, the lottery winner, worried about giving out his name to another's son, as did Kojo after a case he had been involved in 2 years earlier in Minnesota, in which the child's biological father tried to claim child support from the lottery father. It's a long story that I won't go into now, but a very interesting one. With no guarantees in sight, however, Kojo and his client had to rely on the couple's word that they were, quote, devout Christians and would not take advantage of the winner. Here's another interesting detail Kojo added in further parsing the case. He loves working his way through these details. Had destiny treated him differently, he would have been a brilliant courtroom litigator. Quote, after arriving in the U.S., the woman will divorce her visa spouse before returning to Lomé to remarry her husband and apply for a visa for him and an older daughter of theirs. However, since the consulate's registry has her married to another man without daughter, she won't be able to claim their daughter as hers. Instead, her husband will say she's a daughter from a previous marriage and will have to generate the appropriate papers, a birth certificate with another wife's name on it, and a letter from that imaginary wife, allowing him to take their daughter to the U.S. It's also likely, Kojo concluded, that the consul will ask for a DNA test to ensure that the daughter is indeed the second husband's child. But the man will be up to the challenge. Notice here how culture and the law, U.S. immigration and jurisprudential categories, American notions of biological kinship, reconfigure categories of relatedness and belonging at every step, and how this couple must calibrate their future together and their identity according to its logic and through the gaze of its purveyors. Not only must the wife marry a stranger, but also she and her husband will divorce and then remarry, give another man's name to their infant before changing it back, claim their daughter as his but not hers, and create a fictitious former wife for the husband, all the while spending years apart before reuniting as a family. In this chapter, I follow the cases of several visa lottery selectees, exploring the ways in which situational kinship creates new desires and family forms. Located in the interstices between known practice and imagined category, visa lottery kinship is at once reiterative and innovative, drawing on everyday patterns while also refiguring them, kinship with a difference, as it were. Moreover, DV kinship is performative in the fullest Butlerian sense, often bringing into being and making real that which it enacts. This section is called faux real. Question mark. Note that visa lottery couples, faux couples, go through a real marriage ceremony at the courthouse before witnesses and a judge. After exchanging vows and rings, they take pictures with family and friends on the courthouse steps, often following this up with honeymoon photos on the beach or at the swimming pool of the five-star Hotel Sarakawa. In prepping for the embassy interview, they imagine themselves as sweethearts, falling for each other the first time they met, honeymooning together, and become versed in the affective and bodily intimacies of the other, favorite foods and colors, everyday habits, body scars, as if lovers of long standing. As well, they often live together for at least a month, as I said earlier, before the embassy interview, in case the consulate's fraud unit calls for an impromptu house visit, and again for several months after arriving in the U.S. while awaiting their green cards. Given the intensity of this performed conjugality, it should not be surprising that some visa couples fall in love, or better put, since that term betrays cultural bias, end up staying together and having children. While Kojo warns his clients to avoid any romantic involvement until after they get the visa, it's a business relationship, he insists, that will be vastly complicated by a failed romance. Some can't resist and throw caution to the wind before the interview itself. Others wait until they have the visa before indulging their desires. More commonly, desirous couples hold off until they're in the U.S. with enough distance between themselves and spouses or lovers at home before deepening the relationship. I've met couples who have fallen for each other at each of these stages, before the interview, after arriving in the US, with this latter the most common, not only because distance conceals, but also because of the shared intimacy of being together in a faraway place. Regardless of prior commitments, if attracted to one another, if their social indicators, age, class, ethnicity, line up, if the boy has paid the interview fee and plane ticket, but usually not the other way around, the couple could well decide to stay together and have children. But DV romance isn't always so neat. One married winner who began an affair with his lottery wife never told his real wife he'd been selected, let alone he was sleeping with the other woman. The plot thickened when his wife found the money for the embassy interview sent from the States by the man's sister in her husband's belongings and, not knowing what it was for, though clearly having no qualms about stealing from him, replaced several $100 bills with counterfeits. The fake bills were discovered when the man tried to exchange them on the black market, luckily not at the embassy itself, before the interview. He suspected his wife, but couldn't accuse her, since he'd never announced his planned departure for the US or that another woman was paying his way. Another Kojo winner, who also began an affair with his lottery spouse, carelessly left his papers on the table at home with the other woman listed as wife. When his real wife found the papers, she imagined the other woman was trying to steal her husband and went to the embassy to rat them out. Needless to say, insult here added to injury. The man was denied his visa and lost his wife as well. In a case that is ongoing, two friends, one married with 3 children, the other engaged to be married, one as a married couple. Two friends sometimes apply together as a lark, never imagining they'll be selected. In fact, many people in Lomé just do it every year. They've done it for the last 15 years, and they keep doing it. They do it with a friend here one time, friend there the next time. These two got lucky. Since they filed together, their marriage won't get flagged as a pop-up, which is an embassy term, by the embassy computer. So if you add a spouse after you've been selected, they call it a pop-up, and that's when they get deeply suspicious that these are real. And since the primary applicant has the baccalaureate, the high school diploma, their case should sail through the vetting and interview process. So these are two friends who applied together, right? The woman won. And when they go for the embassy interview, they won't get seen as a pop-up, and their case should be open and shut. I think they're going in June of this year for the interview. All they need are appropriately backdated marriage papers, easily obtained from a judge friend of Kojo's at the préfecture. But entanglements at home have intervened. The man's wife, who doesn't know her husband has been selected, nor that he applied with another woman, has already accused him, apparently wrongly, of having an interest in this female friend. Moreover, the man is a pastor who will now have to set Christian principles aside to engage in a second polygamous union. For her part, the woman is hesitant to go through a marriage ceremony with a man who is not her fiancé. Because of these complications, the couple decided not to proceed. This was last summer, and I saw them in Kojo's office one day when he tried to convince them otherwise. But a friend sent them to Kojo, who recognized a sure thing and urged them to stay the course, insisting that this was the chance of a lifetime, that their visas were virtually guaranteed, that all would be forgiven at home when the man's wife and children and the woman's fiancé were on the other side of the Atlantic. Not surprisingly, Kojo won out, but he insisted the couple tell no one of their good fortune, especially the man's wife, until after they received their visas. He worried that if the wife found out, she would go to the embassy and spoil the case. Kojo also eased the woman's disquiet about marrying her friend by getting the judge to let them sign the marriage papers without appearing in court. Kojo himself is not unimplicated in such dynamics. He's married 3 of his clients, but failed at the embassy interview each time. So now he is trying to send his real wife to the States as the spouse of one of his winners, where once on the other side, she'll divorce the winner, remarry Kojo, and bring him to the US. But given all these infidelities, these real marriages that dissolve, these fake marriages that become real, shouldn't he be worried about marrying his wife to another? You ought to be, a friend cajoled in his office one afternoon last July. Your wife is a beautiful woman. If given the chance, I'd sleep with her in a minute. When she and her lottery husband are far away in the US, you don't think that man, and perhaps your wife as well, will be tempted? I've thought of that already, Kojo countered, and will send my wife to live with one of my friends, or perhaps even with the American here, not with her visa spouse. But the lottery is risky business, and that's a risk I'm willing to take. This section is called bride wealth, as it were. If performing conjugality can produce conjugality, it is also the case that conventional conjugal entitlements may seep into lottery practice. Thus, some financing husbands see the visa payment as a type of bride wealth, which entitles them to marital rights. In one instance, a stateside Kojo client expected his visa spouse, the one he'd financed, to cook for him and share his bed. Another case of a man who paid the woman's fees and plane ticket, then felt entitled after their arrival in the States, had an unusual twist. The woman refused the man's advances while keeping the door open, insisting that if he wanted to sleep with her, he would have to return to Lomé to ask her parents for her hand and pay the marriage gifts. Only then would she consider capitulating to his desire. Certainly, why wouldn't it? Kojo responded to my query about the bride wealth analogy. The boy is investing in the woman's future. This is what a woman looks for in a husband, someone who will take care of her. He then added, as confirmation that it is a type of dot, bride wealth, think about this. All the arranged marriages that become real are when the boy is financing. If the girl is paying for the boy, it's unlikely they'll continue as a couple. Girls don't pay bride wealth. But consider the upshot. Among other things, the diversity lottery is a marriage-generating institution, enabling Togolese to meet one another and fashion futures together. When I put it to Kojo in this way, he laughed and said, yes, of course the lottery can be the occasion for marriage, but what's the difference between meeting your future wife at the beach, at the shopping mall, or through the lottery? The section is called Identity Exchange. An extravagant case of improvisational kinship, what the consul who described it to me referred to as identity theft, came to the embassy's attention in 2011. A lottery winner had put his wife's name on the application but couldn't afford the interview fee or plane ticket, and found a financier in the US who needed papers and was willing to assume his wife's identity. The gambit worked. The woman returned to Lomé, obtained a birth certificate and passport in the wife's name, and passed the embassy interview. And after returning to the States, finally had her green card. Of necessity, she kept using the name of the other because all of her papers were in that other's name. And at one point, she returned to Lomé to renew her passport, again in the other woman's name. A few weeks later, that woman, the man's real wife, applied for a passport and was turned down because she was told she already had a passport which had been recently renewed. Confused, she had no idea her husband had sold her name to this woman. She filed a complaint with the Ministry of Justice, which traced the passport and contacted the embassy. After confirming what had transpired and speaking to all parties involved, the State Department began deportation proceedings against the woman, though surprisingly not against the man. An even more Byzantine case of DV identity substitution, a man taking on the identity of his deceased cousin, his wife marrying the dead man, what anthropologists are fond of calling ghost marriage, came to a sad denouement in 2008. A man who had been selected in the lottery died before he was able to go for the interview. Not wanting to let a golden opportunity slip by, his cousin decided to step into the shoes of the deceased and go for the interview in his name. He thus applied for a passport in the cousin's name while using his own picture and married his wife to the dead man. There was a delay at the passport office, however, with rumors circulating that authorities were tightening up on fraud, and he decided not to retrieve his passport, thus foregoing the embassy interview. As luck would have it, the man's wife was selected in the lottery the following year, this time as herself. Since she had the baccalaureate and had listed her spouse and children on the application, there should have been an open and shut case. But at the interview, the consul asked if she'd ever applied before. She had chosen to leave blank the section on the application where they ask you to declare any previous spouses. And she replied no, preferring, she later said, to risk that the consul hadn't noticed she'd applied the year before as the spouse of another, to saying yes and having to account for why she'd married two men in the same year. But the consul had run a photo recognition test. They do all this biometric stuff now, fingerprinting, photo, and DNA if it's children. which checks an applicant's picture against all others in the system, and held up the one she'd used on her application the previous year, asking if it wasn't her picture. She admitted it was, and, caught in a lie, was denied the visa. Sad not only because she and her husband were fully legitimate and had an application that met all the requirements, but also because, sensing a sure thing, they had mortgaged home and property to come up with the interview money for themselves and each of their 3 children, over $3,000. This section is called, How Different Is This? While stretching relatedness into novel terrain, visa lottery kinship is nevertheless cut from the same cloth as Togolese everyday kinship. Improvisational pragmatics, the privileging of interest over love or biology, assuming fictive identities, document manipulation, all these are the stuff of kinship as known and practiced, and all have the same goal, satisfying concrete needs, both material and social, by whatever means possible. This is why few Togolese I have spoken to find what Kojo does odd or suspect, and why even high-ranking state officials, even ministers, are his clients. Last July, for instance, an acquaintance from northern Togo told me he just married his fiancée, but registered theirs as a false marriage at the préfecture, where he said they have 2 marriage registers, one real, the other false, because he didn't want her father to find out that they were married. The father, a local politician, was against the marriage because my friend was Christian, not Muslim, and because he couldn't stomach the idea of his daughter marrying, quote, the son of my enemy. The father had been a lifelong political opponent of Togo's dictator, Yadema, who hailed from the same ethnic group as my friend. By registering the marriage in the shadow register, my friend was attempting to assure that the girl's well-connected father wouldn't be able to discover their clandestine union and spoil their plans for a future together. But all Togolese I know have stories like this, of document manipulation, of assuming the identity of another, of turning relatedness upside down to meet needs, of counterfeits and shadow deals all around. In the northern community where I work, villagers recently gamed a Danish NGO that was sponsoring girls to attend school, though only one per family, by sending second and third daughters to live with relatives or friends, where those friends claimed their daughters as theirs. In the same village, a man I know has 3 birth certificates for each of his children, one from when they were born, another from when a school teacher urged him to take 4 years off their ages so they wouldn't be disadvantaged when looking for jobs. This is very common in the schools of the North. It's the French system, and so children are often held back. I mean, everyone I know is held back not just once, but 2, 3, 4, 5 times, right? So they're much older than they should be when they, if they get through. And the third birth certificate from when this man discovered that the teachers had taken his money and run, never registering them and leaving the family with fake certificates. These are everyday realities in this post-colony, and it is in this sense that I mean that visa lottery practice is of a piece with, rather than a departure from, quotidian kinship. Togolese inhabit a world one might call allegorical, in which there are hidden meanings to every text, to every encounter, to every relationship, and in which little is as it appears. Nothing is self-evident, and transparency, that key word of the international community and of the consulate, finds little place in people's everyday lives or lexicons. But is it only Togolese or West Africans who traffic in non-transparent, compromised identities these days? Are we not living in a global age when moving between real and fake, assuming for the moment those categories have stable meaning, defines social personhood broadly, and in which the boundary between the two is forever blurred? Product piracy is virtually synonymous with global capitalism today. How to verify, for instance, whether your Nokia is real or not, whether your North Face jacket is a knockoff, whether you were taken for a ride when you bought a piece of designer clothing. Then, too, Americans cheat on their taxes and their spouses with such regularity that non-cheaters are today the exception. And American university students plagiarize essays by purchasing them on the internet and cheat on exams at alarmingly high rates. Wall Street investors, well, we all know what they did in 2008, nearly bringing the global financial system to its knees with their shadow accounts, their swindling of clients, and their complicity in allowing the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time to flourish in the belly of the beast. Nor is it any accident, and indeed I see it as symptomatic, that American pop culture is positively obsessed with conspiracy theory. Many of the most watched television shows of the past 5 years are dripping with conspiracy thinking, driven by the message that things are not as they appear, and that there are dark forces lurking behind every event. Americans, too, I would insist, inhabit allegorical worlds. This section is called DNA Surprises. DNA testing became the new fix of the embassy in the mid-2000s, promising a surefire, transparent way of catching those trying to add children, the children of others, to their dossiers. Despite the apparent certainties DNA testing provided, however, surprises and unintended consequences and opportunities remained in store for both sides, providing yet another example of the difficulty of closing loopholes to eliminate fraud and using the latest science to do so. The embassy was especially likely to ask for a DNA test if children were not declared on the original application, but then popped up after selection. If they were declared on the original application, the consul assumed that they were the couple's own biological children. But of course, such is not always the case. In Togo and throughout much of the sub-region, child fostering is common, and children circulate between households all the time, both within village and city and between the two. Moreover, a child's father is defined by marriage, not genealogy, by social rather than biological criteria. Thus, a woman's child, by anyone other than her husband, a lover, even a rapist, belongs to her husband, not to the biological father. All to say that it is unlikely that all Togolese children, claimed as such, will conform to American definitions, definitions which lie behind the DNA test, or that those enlisting the names of siblings' children are doing so knowingly and dishonestly. While the embassy's romance with DNA made it harder than before to add non-biological children after selection, Kojo, always parsing fine differences, found a small window that he felt would give him room to maneuver. He wondered whether adding small children to a dossier, infants who had been born since the time of the application, namely children under 2, it can take 2 years, as I said earlier, from time of application to interview, might get through without being called for a DNA test. He guessed right, and in the 2 cases he tried a year ago, he was successful. Both were children of others who, in possession of a fictive birth certificate, passed as the children of a winner. Moreover, he toyed with the idea that some wealthy non-applicant who wanted U.S. citizenship for their child might try such a strategy and bankroll a couple in need. While unlikely, who would care for the child in the States, it's not entirely far-fetched. A recent fad among well-off Togolese women, wives of ministers, members of the political elite, has been to get pregnant, then apply for a tourist visa to the U.S., then give birth on American soil so that their child will have U.S. citizenship. But in jumping on the DNA bandwagon, the surprise in store for the embassy was that a DNA mismatch might reveal not so much a fake marriage as a marital infidelity. In December 2011, the consulate was pulled into just such a case. When a Togolese couple in the U.S. applied to bring over their 3 children and was asked to get DNA tests, positive matches with both parents were found for only 2 of the children. The third was positive for the mother alone. When informed of the results, the couple, presumably distraught and quarreling, pleaded with the consul in a barrage of emails from the States to not tell their families back home where the children were staying. The irony in this case was that since the wife already had U.S. citizenship, she could have applied on her own to bring over all 3. But of course, had she attempted to do so, her husband would have been let in on her secret. This case had a happy ending, however, as the consulate, in a generous gesture, allowed the woman to apply again to bring over the 3 children, but now on her own. But consider the upshot. The consulate won't permit polygamous unions or give visas to the children of such unions. Indeed, if they discover you're a polygamist, you can't go for the embassy interview. But they will allow, apparently, adulterous ones, or at least they were willing to in this case. This section is called Consular Kinship. I'm almost done. Cultural specificities attend the definition of the kinship unit, the family, that lies at the heart of the visa lottery system. Those who apply for the lottery and go for the interview must conform to consular, to Euro-American definitions of family, that of a husband-wife pair and their biological children. But, as suggested above, Togolese family definition is far more capacious, consisting not only of a man and his wife or wives, but also all those children, whether biological or not, that a conjugal unit is taking care of and feeding. Since they are calling the shots and offering citizenship as a gift, it is of course within rights for the State Department to set definitions as they wish. But in so doing, and insisting on American kinship norms, they create all sorts of problems and suspicions for themselves. Namely, they suspect Togolese of trying to scam them, that is, of knowing better and deliberately lying or engaging in fraud, when they add the names of siblings' children or girlfriends' children to their dossier, when in fact they may just be playing by local rules, caught up in different cultural understandings of family. The cultural bias that interests me even more, however, as it lies at the very heart of consular anxiety about the so-called fraud that surrounds the entire system, is the one that tries to differentiate a real from an arranged or fake marriage. In the normative American view, romance, not interest, defines the conjugal unit. But how in any marriage, anywhere, to discover whether interest or love is operating? And how is a consul going to pass such judgment after a 10-minute interview? One index the consulate relies on is whether the couple declared itself as such on the original application. In such a case, the consuls assume it was a legitimate or real marriage, rarely doubting its authenticity and subjecting the couple to cross-examination. But recall the case of the two friends, one already married, the other engaged, playing together as a lark, with both names on the original application. They will get their visas without the consul batting an eye. Or what if a married couple appears on the original application whose marriage was arranged, influenced by the heavy imprint of their families, as many still are today? Because declared early in the process, the embassy assumes it's a love marriage, and the couple will pass through. On the flip side, a couple that constitutes itself specifically for the visa lottery, that marries with the express purpose of getting a U.S. green card, is considered illegitimate. Here, interest, rather than love, is thought to define their relationship. For Togolese, however, all marriages are interested. Quote, a woman marries a man with money, someone who can care for her, Kojo said one day. A man marries a woman who will bear him children. Romance and the love you Americans imagine as the center of a marriage is not as important for us. Sure, if this couple also likes one another, all the better. But what's important are those interests of money and children. How is a lotto visa marriage any different? When I pressed Kojo on the point, he turned the question around and asked how uninterested European marriages are. Don't you two marry for money or class or beauty? How many rich Americans marry poor Americans? How many white Americans marry black Americans? Not many. Few people just marry as such. And what about, I continued, the consular charge that the difference is that DV marriages are expedient, too interest-driven, that people are marrying just to get the visa and then divorced? Well, as you know, he responded, some lottery unions end up in marriage. But also I know that many American marriages based on love end quickly as well. So I'm not sure that the length of time that a couple remains married should be determining. So there's no such thing as a faux mariage, I asked. I never use that term, he said. For me, all marriages are arrangés et intéressés. By way of conclusion, just before they go for the embassy interview, Kojo gives his clients a pep talk, telling them that, having been selected in the lottery, they have a right to their visa and to U.S. citizenship, and that no one can take it away. If they stand strong and show courage and intelligence during the interview, they will get their visas. A fascinating moment occurred at a pre-interview session I was present at a year ago. Kojo ended the session by telling the couple that they, not the consul, held the truth, la vérité, about their case. The embassy knew nothing about them, he said, except what was written on their forms and what they would say during the interview. The entire case is in your hands, he concluded. This view that the world they constructed and performed in words constituted the truth about their world, that there was no outside to their words or to the documents, no external proof that their story wasn't true, that all was relative to that which they performed before the consul, struck me as flawless in its logic. and fully in step with post-colonial times, as well as representing sage advice for the challenge ahead. This moment also helped me make sense of a puzzling statement of Kojo's several years earlier. In 2005, when the embassy sensed, perhaps for the first time, that there was hustling going on around the lottery, the U.S. ambassador went on Togolese television to warn against visa fraud and to say that, going forward, the consulate would assume that all who came for the DV interview were lying, and that it was up to them to prove otherwise. Despite my own astonishment at this presumption that an interviewee might be considered a fraudster until proven innocent, Kojo was positively pleased with the ambassador's statement, saying that it confirmed what he'd assumed about the process all along and played to his strength, namely that it was the responsibility of those being interviewed to present all the right proof of papers, high school diploma, marriage certificate, papers of professional affiliation, and so on, and that if they did, they would be granted visas. Thus, too, implicitly, that the consulate would have to catch the couple in a lie or an inconsistency for them to be denied. Thus, it's up to him, Kojo, to prepare an airtight case, for which he is famous, to produce a married couple with a perfectly believable, consistent story and with documents to match. If that's their charge, I should win every time, he said. Kojo also felt that the ambassador's televised comments were an invitation to join the fray, which is something he lives for. Thanks very much. I'd be glad to take questions. Yes. Yeah, I see it all over in Togo, certainly. And what's always been surprising to me is how, in that sort of environment, you can never trust anyone, right? And I've asked this to Kojo, and he said, oh, well, there's all sorts of, it's always pragmatic, And he has been double-crossed by his best friend, who won the visa lottery and owed him a lot of money, and split for the States. And they finally, after about 5 years, made up when this friend returned to Lomé. And he said, well, you just get used to that. That happens all the time. You cut your losses. Next time, now he's actually doing business deals with this guy again. They're importing aluminum from China to Ghana. And they're working together, and they're, fronting one another money and so on. And he, it's sort of very pragmatic. He said you can never tell. I assume, and for that matter within families, right? I don't know if Peter Gashir has a lovely new book about witchcraft imaginaries coming out through Chicago soon. I just read the proofs of it. And he begins with that. He says witchcraft is always at the heart of the family, right? The person who may do you in is the one right next to you. How do you inhabit the everyday knowing that possibility, right? So I think it's very much a part of these. I still can't fully get to the bottom of it, but I think there is a sort of world of dissimulation that people inhabit all the time, and they apparently do it very comfortably. But I would say that we do to some extent too, right? I mean, that was the point of that short section. Well, most people who sign up are boys for a range of reasons. What Kojo does is he goes and sets up shop at the university, because now he's just recruiting university students because they all have the back, and so they can go for the embassy interview. And women are more suspicious when you set up shop and start taking people's pictures. And they, if they don't know the person. So this year he sent a woman friend of his to take pictures, and he got a lot more female applicants. But historically, it's been mostly boys. And if it's and so it's often the girl's side that is financing the arrangement, which does give her an upper hand in that sense. If it's the other way around, as I said a few minutes ago, then the you know, then it's seen as a type of bride wealth, and the boy is in a totally, you know, sort of normative standard superior position. But there is some, you know, there is some play. I mean, all of these things are in play. They're constantly playing with these hierarchies and turning them around. Yeah, you know, everyone wants to leave today because there's nothing back home, right? And they see their chances for supporting family back home, and not just close family, but even broader than that, of getting here and sending money back, even though they're in these really, you know, low-paying jobs. I mean, it's really sad to see. The last chapter of the book is following Togolese once they've arrived here. What happened to their fantasy? How are they living? You know, they're all getting by, and because of the U.S. economy, they can send a little bit back every month. But they all want to go home. They all want to go home. When I was in Lomé in December, there were 3 or 4 who I'd met, and they were the happiest people I'd ever seen. And there was a woman who I saw the day before she had to fly back, and she was in tears. She said, "I don't want to go back," but she had to, right? And her family won't accept her back because they rely on her. The whole brain drain question, I've always had a slightly different view of that. There are, I mean, first, there just aren't jobs at home, right? So even if they stayed, what would they do? But there are so many talented people waiting in the wings. You know, you lose one brilliant person and there's 100 more ready to step up, you know, and they learn very quickly, they know what to do, and so on. The jobs, you know, that Togolese can apply for, I mean, it used to be mechanic. Now it's a mechanic who can work on computerized vehicles, which is ruled out most Togolese. You know, tailoring was a big deal. You know, if you were a tailor, you could. And one consul said, you know, in 2006, everyone in Togo became a tailor all of a sudden, right? Peintre de bâtiment, house painter, was one. You know, all those are off the list now. And most Togolese, it's really the high school diploma. I haven't heard of anyone go through, you know, with a job, but they aren't, you know, you know, tech people. They're university graduates, but they're, you know, they don't have the sorts of skills, you know, unlike, say, South Asians, right, who can come here and fall right into the, you know, the high-tech industry, engineers and so on. They just don't have the skills that are recognized here. Are you sure it's fake bug? Because the one, there's 2 offices in Lomé where you can't fake it, the baccalauréat and the passport office. You can't get a fake passport. And I've been told again and again, and if anyone knew how to do this, it would be Kojo. He said you can't get anyone at the back office. I've asked that about the passport office, and his answer is that there's a guy at the passport office who is just, you know, who can't be had at the passport office. The back is, so the embassy, I don't think this speaks to that, though. The embassy apparently just sends a number, not a name, to the back office, and they get a yes or no back. I don't, it's a good question. I'll ask that. You know, I'm going to be in Lomé in a week. I'll ask that. But until, you know, 2005, a lot of people were coming through with jobs, not with the back. But again, I mean, there's a whole chapter I have on the job stuff. I mean, it was totally, you know, Kojo would, you know, get people, you know, apprenticed into, you know, soldering, you know, in an iron shop, and, you know, get everyone to go along with it. On the site visit, the fraud unit would go out, oh yes, this guy works here, and so on and so on. And they would get very technical questions. How do you join, these types of joints as opposed to those types of joints? And they could answer all of them. Some of them were legit and others weren't. But a lot of them were doing it on the job stuff. And then the job stuff just completely dried up about 4 years ago. Well, I think it's both. I mean, it's part of this vast, you put it nicely, this vast array of networks. Kojo's doing this. He also has all these gigs going on at the port. He's got his buddy here, and they're, importing aluminum from China. And within his families, there's other. He has two brothers in Germany. One of them is a liaison between the German Soccer Federation and the Togolese. He's recruiting Togolese into the European leagues. All of these, and it's all about relationships and these networks all the time, right? I followed a tire deal where you import used tires from Germany in these big containers, like 3,000 tires, and it fills like almost a football field. I mean, it was amazing. And I actually helped bankroll this operation. There's two kids I knew from the village in the north, and they came to me after years of, nothing working. And they said, this will work. And I did my own research, and everyone said, yes, you can actually make quite a bit of money on this. All I wanted was my money back, and I lost about $20,000. And at the end of the day, and we did it twice, and I followed everything. It was absolutely fascinating. But at the end of the day, what they said was, well, we developed a lot of good relationships in the process of this. We didn't make any money. But we have relations all over the place. At the same time, the visa lottery is their way out. I mean, it's their way to opt out of, of a life that they see as just constant hustle and always living on the margins. I mean, they all get by, but there's no big future for them, In the 70s and 80s, folks who went to Europe and came to the States all went back home. There were civil service jobs for them. All that switched. People even with jobs in banks or school teachers, if they win the visa lottery, they're gone. Yeah, well, they get married, they have kids. That's a certain type of future and an important future, right? I know a couple of women in their early 30s, and they say, we may never have families, we may never have children. If we die without children, it's the saddest of funerals. But they're all in the informal economy. They're all hustling. They're all hustling. Deals come through, and then they live on that for a while. They share it with all their friends, another friend, and so on. There's in Togo. There's a comparative question here. I mean, we would need to move beyond Togo. In Togo, there's a small political elite that is quite wealthy and drives big cars, and they own the taxis. There's most of the it's motorcycle taxis in Lomé that is the way to get around. Most of the drivers don't own their own machines. Most of them are college graduates. That's all they can do in the hot sun, 10 hours a day, and they get something like, $6 a week for that work, right? I mean, that's very typical. It's really sad. I mean, very, very talented people. There's just nothing, there for them other than this sort of pushing money from here to there. So there's a small elite at the top that is very well off and makes sure that it stays that way. There's a lot of money that comes in through the port. When the civil war broke out in Cote d'Ivoire, a lot of the traffic, ocean traffic, came over to Lomé, and they have a very nice port. But all of it stays within the political elite, the president's family, and so on. Yeah. That's a great question, and I can't answer it. I haven't been there, in the heart of those relationships. My guess is there's a lot of improvisation and contestation and sort of new ideas, that are popping out, especially once folks get over on this side. You know, but marriage remains incredibly important. Marriage and having kids remains incredibly important for people. And the families, you know, always have to be involved, or usually are involved. And I've been to many of these, you know, in folks that are ministers' children and so on. I mean, very well educated and so on. There's always this sort of exchange of gifts. And it's that marriage, which isn't official, it's not at the préfecture, but that's the most important moment. And then there's also, if you want to go get your papers, you can. A lot of people don't have their papers. And then if you want to have a church marriage. So there's sort of three moments, right? And the church marriage can often happen, you know, 25 years later. Yeah, it's of course, it's fluid. It's very fluid in all sorts of ways. And there are a lot of new, you know, there's a lot of sort of discourse about love. Valentine's Day is huge, you know, bigger there than, you know, here. In a lot of ways. The text messaging that goes on Valentine's Day is just extraordinary, right? And they love the idea, they talk about sort of love and romance. At the end of the day, they usually, yes, all that's fine. And then they will say, like Kojo said, it would be great if the person I marry is also the one that I have romance with.